I'm doing a solo install of a complete HVAC system for this house. It's critical that I have a sturdy and level concrete base for the AC condenser, but I also have a budget. Over 90% of the cost of a concrete pad like this is in labor. I saved over $500 by doing this myself. I get started by cleaning up the area where I think I want the pad to go. This helps me visualize the area and plan out in my head what I think I want things to look like when I'm done. My next step is to construct the concrete form. Now, in my case, I prefer using 2x6s because if I'm trying to pour a 4-inch thick pad, if I'm using 2x4s, those are actually only 3.5 inches thick. So 2x6s gives me a more reliable way of getting to my desired thickness, which I'll explain in more detail later in the video. Once I've cut the pieces of wood to the desired length, and keep in mind it's the interior of the box that matters in terms of measurements. So if you're using 2x, then just add 1.5 inches to all your cuts. Okay, I've got my box here that is 28.5 by 46.5. It's going to be the perfect size for the condenser that we're going to put on top of the concrete pad. Now at this point, I placed the form in the area I cleared out. Again, just for me to help me visualize what the pad will look like. I really like this yard spray paint. I used this also for my drainage project in this same yard. And I use it to mark the edges of the form so that I know exactly where I need to dig out a base. And I measure a distance from the wall that fits my use case. In this case, I'm putting an AC condenser, and it has a requirement that the intake has to be at least 12 inches from the wall. So I'm actually measuring 9 inches from the edge of the pad to the side of the house so that I have a correct spacing for the condenser and so that the pad lines up parallel with the side of the house. You can see here, I'm not digging a hole as much as I'm scraping away the surface. You just want to get past the loose dirt on the top layers of soil. And I use a few bags of gravel and then tamp it down to provide a level, even, sturdy base for the pad. I'm also using the gravel in this case to level the form. I'm not using stakes in the way that you'll see most other forms secured to the ground. If you level the form using the gravel and then pour a little bit of gravel inside the form, this accomplishes two goals at once. It makes sure that the top surface and bottom foundation of the pad are both level, and if you're using 2x6s, it reduces the thickness of the pad from 5.5 to whatever you want. In this case, I measure out 4 inches. The static pressure of the gravel inside the form pushing outwards, combined with these stakes I'm just nailing around the perimeter of the form, work together to make sure the form doesn't move around while I'm pouring the concrete. It's finally time for the fun part. I picked up 8 bags of concrete for this project. I ended up only using 7 60-pound bags. And if you've never mixed concrete before, it's really not complicated. If you want, you can read the bag and measure out the water, mix in the perfect amounts. But in my case, I just kind of spray the hose in there, mix it up with the shovel until the consistency sort of looks like what I imagine concrete to look like. That'll work out fine. And you don't have to worry about this hardening really quickly. Regular concrete that comes in these bags doesn't set up quickly at all. It takes a few hours for it to start to get really hard, so you have plenty of time to mix and pour. Before you make that first pour, though, I would recommend just taking a hose and doing a quick spray of the inside of the form as well as the base, whether it's gravel or dirt or anything else. Concrete uses water to cure, and wood is absorbent. So you don't want the two to be in competition. This will make the form a lot easier to remove later on. Now, because I know the top of my form is level, I can take another piece of wood and screed off any extra concrete to make it flush with the top of the form. Now I use a round end finishing trowel to smooth out the surface, and an edger to give the pad a defined edge and to make the form easier to remove later. You can find links to these and all the other tools I use in this project in the description of the video. I make a couple light passes with the finishing trowel over the surface of the concrete. It's hard to describe exactly what I'm going for here, but you know it when you see it. Once the surface is mostly smooth, you can take a break for a little while because the concrete needs to set up and cure and harden a little bit more before you put the finishing touches on. But in the meantime, I need to make sure I remember to clean off my tools. If the concrete is allowed to dry and harden on the tools, there's no getting it off later. Likewise, when you were screeding, if any concrete may have spilled over the edge of the form, that little pile next to the form is also going to harden. It's going to make it more difficult to get the form off, and it might have worked its way into the screw heads that you use to build the form, and getting those screws out later is going to be really tough if there's concrete in there. So it's worth spending a few minutes just to clean up the area and getting rid of any extraneous concrete that may cause problems later in the process. In my case, I waited about 3 hours because I'm doing this in winter. It's cool and cloudy. In a lot of cases, you may be able to wait as little as an hour, but the point is you want to let things firm up a little bit before you take the form off without the concrete wanting to turn back into a blob. And you can run the edger again because when the concrete is firmer, it'll be easier with the edger to get a more defined edge. Anyway, once I reach this stage, I'm actually done for the day. I'm going to let this set up overnight, and I'll come back tomorrow and remove the form once the concrete has had about a day to cure. At this point, it's over a day after I poured the concrete, and it's time for me to remove the form. The only advice I can give here is this is best done carefully. As for finishing touches, I surround the pad with a little bit of gravel, and there's a little bit more nurturing that has to go on for the next day or so with the pad. I wouldn't put anything on it quite yet, even though technically it can withstand the weight. To ensure that it cures properly over the next few days and weeks, you'll want to make sure it doesn't get too sunny or dry. Again, same thing with the wood surrounding it. You don't want it to compete for moisture. As the concrete cures and the top starts to dry off, it's not a terrible idea to periodically wet down the concrete with a hose. Just make sure you spray it lightly. You don't want to disturb the surface with any water pressure. And finally, after a couple days, I can finally use this thing. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, I'm installing a full central AC and heating system in this house, and I'm using this Mr. Cool condenser. This is a 2-ton unit that will serve the second floor of this house. And all I need to do now is kind of wiggle it into place. All right, looks good.